After 30 years of marriage and building a multi-million-dollar empire together, my husband walked into our corner office on a Tuesday morning and told me I was fired from my own company. What he didn't know was that I had been 3 steps ahead of him for months, and by Friday, I would be the one holding the keys to everything we'd built, while he scrambled to explain to investors why the real brain behind Meridian Technologies was no longer speaking to him. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It was supposed to be just another board meeting, the kind we'd held hundreds of times over the past 15 years since Meridian Technologies went from a garage startup to a Fortune 500 consulting firm. I sat in my usual seat at the mahogany conference table in our downtown Ashford office, reviewing quarterly projections on my tablet while waiting for the other board members to arrive. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the polished surface where I'd made countless decisions that turned our little tech consulting business into a $200 million company. Richard walked in at exactly 9 a.m., as he always did, but something was different. Instead of his usual warm smile and quick kiss on my cheek, our private ritual before business mode kicked in, he wouldn't meet my eyes. His expensive charcoal suit was perfectly pressed, his silver hair styled with the same precision he'd maintained since our early days, but his hands were trembling slightly as he set down his leather briefcase. Behind him walked our 7 board members, including his brother Harold from the legal department, our CFO, Patricia Wells, and longtime investors who'd known us since we started in my grandmother's basement in 1994. But there was someone else. Someone who made my stomach drop the moment I saw her confident stride and perfectly manicured nails. Natasha Crawley, the 28-year-old executive assistant Richard had hired 6 months ago, despite my concerns about her qualifications. She carried herself with an authority that no assistant should have in a board meeting, her red stilettos clicking against the marble floor with the rhythm of someone who owned the room. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a sleek bun, and she wore a navy dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. When she took the seat directly across from me, my business partner's seat, I knew this wasn't going to be the quarterly review I'd prepared for. "Thank you all for coming," Richard began, his voice carrying that formal tone he used with difficult clients. He still wouldn't look at me. "I've called this emergency meeting to address some concerns that have come to light regarding the company's direction and leadership structure." Leadership structure? I founded this company. I wrote the first business plan on my kitchen table while Richard was still figuring out how to use email. I secured our first major contract with Davidson Industries by sleeping in my car outside their headquarters for 3 days until the CEO agreed to see me. Every algorithm we used, every client relationship we built, every innovation that made us millions, it all started with my vision. "I'm sorry, what concerns?" I asked, my voice steady despite the ice forming in my chest. That's when Natasha opened her designer portfolio and slid a stack of documents across the table towards me. The first page was letterhead from Harrison Burke & Associates, the most expensive law firm in the state. The words "vote of no confidence" and "removal from executive position" stood out like neon signs. These documents outline the board's unanimous decision to remove you from your position as Chief Technology Officer effective immediately. There are also provisions for the termination of your company employment contract and the transfer of your company shares to remaining stakeholders. The room spun. My company shares? The shares I'd earned by mortgaging our house 3 times, by missing Christmas dinners to meet impossible deadlines, by crying in bathroom stalls when major deals fell through only to pick myself up and try again. Unanimous? I looked around the table at faces I'd known for years. Patricia, who I'd mentored when she was fresh out of business school. Harold, who'd been Richard's best man at our wedding. These people had sat in my living room for strategy sessions, had celebrated our victories, had trusted me to turn their investments into fortunes. None of them would meet my eyes. "Richard," I said slowly, "what is this really about?" For the first time that morning, he looked directly at me, and I saw something in his brown eyes that made everything click into place. Not just guilt. Ownership, even. The same look he used to give me when we closed major deals, except now it was directed at the young woman sitting in my chair.
"Meredith," he said, using my full name instead of the Mer he'd called me for 3 decades, "the company needs fresh leadership. Someone who understands the current market, who can connect with younger clients. Someone who—" His voice trailed off, but Natasha finished the sentence. "Someone who isn't stuck in outdated methodologies," she said smoothly. "The board has reviewed your recent project proposals, and frankly, they lack the innovation our clients expect. Richard and I have developed new strategies that are already showing promise with several key accounts." Richard and I. The way she said it, with casual ownership, like they were already a team, like 30 years of marriage and partnership could be erased with a PowerPoint presentation and a few signatures. My throat constricted as the full picture became clear. This wasn't just about the company. Richard hadn't just hired an assistant, he'd hired a replacement for everything. My position, my role in the business we'd built together. And judging by the way his wedding ring was conspicuously absent from his left hand, my role in his life as well. The documents in front of me weren't just determination. They were a complete erasure of everything I'd built, designed to leave me with nothing while he and his young protege took over the empire I'd created. I closed the portfolio without reading further and stood up slowly. My legs somehow steadied despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. Every person in that room was about to learn something about Meredith Catherine Hartwell that they'd apparently forgotten over the years. I didn't build a $200 million company by accepting defeat gracefully. "Well," I said, my voice carrying across the silent room like steel wrapped in silk, "this is certainly interesting." I gathered my tablet and purse with deliberate calm, walked to the door, then turned back to face the table of people who thought they'd just witness my downfall. "I hope you all have excellent lawyers," I said with a smile that didn't reach my eyes, "because you're going to need them." The sound of my heels echoing down the hallway was the last thing they heard before their perfect little coup began to unravel. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I met Richard Hartwell on a rainy Thursday evening in 1989 at the Copper Kettle Diner on 5th Street in downtown Ashford. I was 26, working 3 jobs to pay off my computer science degree and surviving on coffee and determination. He was 28, a charming business school graduate who'd just been laid off from his marketing job at a failing electronics company. I'd been hunched over my laptop for hours, debugging code for a small accounting firm's database system, freelance work that paid just enough to keep my tiny studio apartment. The diner stayed open late and had the cheapest coffee in the city. Plus, they didn't mind if I commandeered a corner booth for my makeshift office. Richard stumbled in around 10 p.m., soaking wet and looking like the world had just collapsed around him. His tie was loosened, his normally perfect hair was disheveled, and he had that hollow expression of someone who just watched their future disappear. He ordered black coffee and a slice of apple pie, then sat 3 booths away from mine staring out the rain-streaked window. "Rough day?" I asked when I noticed him checking his empty wallet for the 3rd time. He laughed bitterly. "Rough life, more like it. Company folded today. 12 years of business experience, and apparently none of it matters because I don't understand emerging technologies." He made air quotes around the phrase, whatever the hell that means. I closed my laptop and slid into the seat across from him, curious despite myself. "What kind of business experience?" For the next 2 hours, Richard told me about his work in marketing and client relations, his frustrated dreams of starting his own consulting firm, and his complete bewilderment at how quickly the business world was changing. I told him about my programming projects, my vision for how technology could revolutionize small businesses, and my own dream of building something bigger than freelance work. I said as the diner prepared to close, most people see technology and business as separate worlds. But what if they weren't? What if someone could bridge that gap?
Exactly. I grabbed a napkin and started sketching. Small businesses are terrified of technology because nobody speaks their language. They need someone who can translate their needs into technical solutions and technical solutions back into business benefits. By midnight, we'd filled 17 napkins with business plans, potential client lists, and revenue projections. Richard had the business acumen and people skills I lacked. I had the technical expertise and innovative thinking he needed. It was like finding the missing piece of a puzzle I didn't even know was incomplete. "Partners?" he asked as we stood outside the diner, the rain finally stopping. "Partners," I agreed, and we shook hands under the flickering streetlight. Our first office was my grandmother's basement in the suburbs. Grandma Rosalie had passed away 6 months earlier, leaving me the old Victorian house that I couldn't afford to maintain but couldn't bear to sell. The basement was dry, had electrical outlets, and most importantly, was free. Richard moved in his desk and filing cabinets. I set up my computer equipment and servers. We painted the concrete walls white, hung motivational posters, and called ourselves Hartwell and Associates, even though we had no associates and barely had each other. Those early days were magical in the way that only desperate hope can be. We worked 18-hour days, lived on ramen noodles, and shared dreams, and somehow managed to land our first client within a month. Morrison's Hardware, a family-owned store that needed help setting up a computerized inventory system. I'll never forget the moment we got our first payment, $2,500 for 3 weeks of work. Richard and I stood in that basement, staring at the check like it was made of gold. "We actually did it," he whispered. "We're actually doing it," I corrected him. That night, we celebrated with takeout Chinese food and a bottle of champagne we couldn't afford. We sat on my grandmother's old couch, planning our next moves, and somewhere between the spring rolls and fortune cookies, Richard reached over and kissed me. "I've been wanting to do that since the night we met," he said softly. "I've been hoping you would," I admitted. We were married 18 months later in the same Victorian house where we'd started our business. The ceremony was small, just family and a few friends, but Richard's vows made me cry. He promised to be my partner in everything, to build dreams together, to never let business success change the people we were in that basement. "Meredith Rosalie Fletcher," he said, taking my hands. "You've already given me more than I ever dreamed possible. I promise to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret taking a chance on a guy with a soggy tie and a diner." The early years of marriage and business were a blur of late nights, shared victories, and obstacles we overcame together. When we landed our first major corporate client, Davidson Industries, Richard surprised me with a new wedding ring to replace the simple band we'd bought at a pawn shop. When I developed the client management software that became our signature product, he insisted on putting my name on the patent, even though we shared everything. He said, "Your brain built this. Your name should be on it." We moved the business out of the basement and into a real office, then a bigger office, then a whole floor of a downtown building. With each success, Richard would take me back to that same diner where we met, order apple pie and coffee, and we'd dream about the next milestone. "Remember when we thought $2,500 was real money?" He'd laugh, spreading new financial projections across the sticky table. "Remember when you didn't know what emerging technologies meant?" I'd tease back. By 1999, we had 47 employees and offices in 3 states. By 2005, we'd gone public and were fielding acquisition offers from major corporations. By 2010, we were the premier technology consulting firm in the region, with a client list that read like a Fortune 500 directory. But through it all, we remained us. Richard never made a major business decision without asking my opinion. I never developed a new product without getting his input on market viability. We were true partners in every sense of the word, finishing each other's sentences in client meetings, dividing responsibilities based on our strengths,
building something together that neither of us could have created alone.
Our 20th wedding anniversary fell on the same week that Forbes featured us on their cover as the power couple revolutionizing corporate consulting. In the photo, we're standing in our corner office, looking out at the Ashford skyline we'd helped shape with our success. Not bad for a guy with a soggy tie and a girl with a laptop, Richard had said as we posed for the photographer. Not bad at all, I'd agreed, leaning into his embrace. Looking back now, I can see that 2019 was our peak. The business was thriving, our marriage felt stronger than ever, and we were already talking about our retirement plans. Maybe selling the company and traveling the world, or starting a foundation to help other entrepreneurs get their start. We had no idea that within 5 years, everything we'd built together would become a weapon he'd use against me. The years between 2020 and 2023 were the golden crown of everything Richard and I had built together. If someone had told me during those basement days that we'd eventually own a $200 million empire, I might have laughed. But there we were, sitting at the apex of business success, with a marriage that felt unshakable and a future that stretched endlessly ahead of us. Our Ashford headquarters had expanded to occupy 4 floors of the prestigious Meridian Tower. Yes, we'd grown large enough that they named the building after our company. My corner office on the 47th floor offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, a daily reminder of how far we had traveled from that cramped basement. Richard's office was directly across the hall, connected by a private conference room we called the War Room, where we planned our biggest strategies and celebrated our greatest victories. The business had evolved far beyond our wildest dreams. What started as basic technology consulting had grown into a full-service digital transformation company. We helped Fortune 500 corporations modernize everything from their communication systems to their entire operational infrastructure. Our client roster included 3 of the world's largest banks, 2 major airlines, and dozens of manufacturing companies that relied on our innovations to stay competitive. I developed what the industry called the Hartwell Protocol, a revolutionary approach to integrating artificial intelligence with existing business systems that reduced implementation time by 60% while increasing efficiency by 40%. Major universities were teaching case studies based on my methodologies. Harvard Business School had invited me to guest lecture 3 times. Tech Weekly magazine had named me one of the 50 most influential women in technology for 2 consecutive years. But perhaps what I was proudest of was our company culture. We employed over 300 people across 7 states, and our retention rate was 94%, almost unheard of in the consulting industry. Richard had implemented profit-sharing programs that made our senior employees genuinely wealthy. I'd established mentorship programs that helped dozens of young women break into tech leadership roles. Every quarterly meeting felt like a celebration. Our revenue had grown 35% year over year for 5 consecutive years. We'd been approached by 3 different investment groups wanting to buy us out, but Richard and I always declined. "Why sell our baby when it's just learning to walk?" he'd joke during board meetings. Our personal life was equally fulfilling. We'd finally moved out of the modest house where we'd started our married life and into a custom-built home in Willowbrook Estates, Ashford's most prestigious neighborhood. The house was a perfect blend of our personalities. My love of modern technology integrated seamlessly with Richard's preference for classic elegance. Smart home systems I designed personally controlled everything from lighting to security, while Richard had filled the spaces with carefully chosen antiques and artwork. We'd created a home office that was essentially a smaller version of our corporate war room. Sunday mornings often found us there with coffee and pastries, reviewing the upcoming week's challenges not because we had to, but because we genuinely enjoyed solving problems together. Those moments felt sacred. Just the 2 of us, partners in every sense of the word, building something meaningful. Our 30th wedding anniversary in 2021 was a milestone that felt both monumental and natural. We'd planned a month-long European vacation, our first extended break from the business in over a decade. Richard had insisted on recreating our honeymoon trip to Italy, but this time with the luxury we could finally afford. I still remember the night in Venice when we sat on the terrace of our suite at the Hotel Danieli, watching gondoliers navigate the Grand Canal below. Richard raised his glass of champagne and said, 30 years ago, I married my best friend. Tonight, I'm toasting my greatest business partner, my most trusted advisor, and still my best friend. Only 30 more years to go, I'd replied, clinking my glass against his. Only 30 more years, he'd agreed, and we'd both laughed at the impossibility and certainty of it all. That trip reinforced something we'd always known, but rarely had time to appreciate. We genuinely liked each other, not just loved, liked. We could spend 3 weeks together, 24 hours a day, and never run out of things to discuss. Business strategies, random observations about architecture, debates about which restaurant to try next, dreams about what we wanted to do with our success. When we returned to Ashford, we made a pact to protect that connection. We instituted no business dinners twice a week, where work topics were completely off limits. We started taking weekend trips to the mountains just to disconnect from phones and emails. We even took up dancing lessons, something that seemed absurd for two workaholic business owners, but turned out to be incredibly grounding. The business continued to thrive with these new boundaries in place. In fact, it seemed to perform better when we approached it as a team that also happened to be deeply in love, rather than a couple who worked together. Our employee satisfaction scores reached all-time highs. Our client retention rate improved to 98%. Industry publications started writing articles about our work-life integration model. By early 2023, we were discussing our succession plans seriously for the first time, not because we were ready to retire, but because we were finally secure enough to imagine life beyond the daily grind of running a major corporation. We talked about selling to our employees through a management buyout that would make our senior staff wealthy while preserving the company culture we'd built. I want to travel with you, Richard said one evening as we walked through our neighborhood. I want to see the world without worrying about quarterly reports. I want to sleep in on Tuesday mornings and take afternoon naps and read books that have nothing to do with business strategy. That sounds perfect, I had agreed. But let's give ourselves 2 more years to get everything in order. I want to make sure the Hartwell Protocol is fully documented so other companies can benefit from it. And you should finish developing that leadership training program you've been working on. We were planning our legacy, not just our retirement. The company would continue without us, but it would carry forward our values and innovations. Our employees would prosper. Our clients would continue to receive exceptional service. Everything we'd built would outlast us in the best possible way. I was also finally allowing myself to think about personal dreams I'd deferred for 30 decades. I wanted to write a book about women in technology, maybe establish a foundation to provide scholarships for girls pursuing STEM education. Richard had talked about teaching business ethics at the local university, maybe coaching other entrepreneurs through the early stages of building their companies. We felt invincible that spring. The business was generating more profit than we could spend. Our marriage had never been stronger. Our health was good, our friendships were solid, and our reputation in both business and philanthropic circles was impeccable. We were respected, successful, and genuinely happy. I should have known that happiness of that magnitude couldn't last forever, but I never imagined it would be destroyed by the person I trusted most in the world, with help from someone I'd welcomed into our professional family. The peak of our success became the foundation of my downfall, and I was too busy celebrating our achievements to notice the cracks beginning to form in everything we'd built together. The first sign that something was shifting came in March 2023, disguised as what seemed like excellent news. Richard burst into my office on a Thursday morning with more energy than I'd seen from him in months, practically vibrating with excitement as he dropped into the chair across from my desk. "I found her," he announced, grinning like he'd just solved world hunger. "Found who?" I asked, looking up from the quarterly budget analysis I'd been reviewing. "Our new executive assistant, the one who's going to revolutionize how we handle client relations." He pulled out his phone and showed me a resume. Natasha Crownley, 28 years old, MBA from Northwestern, 3 years at Goldman Sachs in the client services division. She's overqualified for an assistant position, but she specifically wants to work for us. I took the phone and scanned the credentials. On paper, she looked impressive. Almost too impressive.
Why would someone with Goldman Sachs experience want to be an executive assistant? That's a significant step backward career-wise. That's exactly what I thought, so I asked her directly during the phone interview. She said she's tired of the cutthroat Wall Street culture and wants to work somewhere with integrity and innovation. She specifically mentioned your Harvard lectures and said she's been following our company's growth for years. The flattery should have been a red flag, but I'll admit it worked. After 30 years of building something meaningful, it felt validating to attract talent who genuinely respected our work. Did you check her references? Of course. Her supervisor at Goldman said she was brilliant, but too idealistic for investment banking. Apparently, she kept pushing for more ethical client practices. Sound familiar? He winked at me, referencing my own reputation for prioritizing long-term client relationships over short-term profits. Against my better judgment, I was intrigued. We had been discussing the need for someone who could handle more complex client coordination, especially as we prepared for our eventual succession planning. Having someone with high-level financial experience could bridge the gap between our technical innovations and our business operations. When can I meet her? I asked.
Tomorrow afternoon. I've already scheduled a joint interview. The next day, Natasha Crowley walked into our conference room like she owned it. She was striking in that polished, professional way that commanded attention without seeming to try. Blonde hair in a perfect chignon, navy blazer that probably cost more than most people's monthly salaries, and a handshake that was firm without being aggressive. But it was her preparation that impressed me most. She'd clearly researched not just our company, but my specific contributions to the industry. She asked intelligent questions about the Hartwell Protocol, suggested improvements to our client onboarding process, and demonstrated a nuanced understanding of our market position that would have been impressive from a senior consultant, let alone someone applying for an assistant role. I'm particularly interested in how you've managed to maintain such high client retention while scaling so rapidly, she said, directing the question to me specifically. Most consulting firms struggle with quality control during growth phases, but you've actually improved your service metrics. I'd love to understand the systems thinking behind that achievement. Richard beamed at her insight. I found myself nodding along, genuinely engaged by her questions. By the end of the hour-long interview, we were both convinced we'd found someone special. I think she could grow into much more than an assistant role, I told Richard as we walked back to our offices. Absolutely. Maybe we've finally found someone we can groom for senior management. We hired her the following Monday with a starting salary that was 40% higher than typical for her position, plus a fast-track promotion plan that could see her in a director-level role within 2 years. I personally designed her orientation program, introducing her to our key clients and walking her through the strategic thinking behind our major initiatives. The first month was everything we'd hoped for. Natasha exceeded every expectation. She streamlined our client communication systems, identified inefficiencies in our project management workflows, and even suggested a new service offering that led to a $2.3 million contract with Davidson Industries. She's like a younger version of you, Richard said admiringly after Natasha's presentation to the senior staff. Same strategic mind, same attention to detail. I should have been flattered. Instead, something about the comparison made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't articulate. The shift started small, so small I initially dismissed it as my imagination. Richard began staying later at the office, claiming he was helping Natasha understand our client histories and strategic approaches. When I offered to take over some of that mentoring, he waved off my suggestion. She specifically requested to work with me on the business development side. You're already swamped with the technical implementations for the Morrison account. Then came the closed-door meetings. Richard and Natasha would disappear into his office for hours at a time, emerging with exciting new ideas and client strategies. When I asked about these sessions, Richard was always enthusiastic but vague. We're working on some innovative approaches to client retention. Natasha has some fascinating insights from her Goldman days about relationship management. I started noticing other small changes. Richard's wardrobe underwent a subtle upgrade. Newer suits, different cologne, a more modern hairstyle that took years off his appearance. When I complimented him on looking refreshed, he credited Natasha's suggestions about updating our professional image to appeal to younger executives.
She pointed out that some of our competitors look more contemporary in their marketing materials. Maybe it's time we evolved our presentation style. The most unsettling change was in our evening routine. For years, Richard and I had debriefed each day over dinner, sharing challenges, celebrating wins, and planning the next day's priorities. Suddenly, he seemed distracted during these conversations, checking his phone frequently and offering abbreviated responses to my questions about ongoing projects. "Everything okay?" I asked one evening in May, after he'd barely touched his dinner. "Of course. Just thinking through some complex client situations. Natasha and I have been working on a presentation for the Blackstone Group, and I want to make sure we get the strategic positioning exactly right." Blackstone Group was a potential client I'd been cultivating for 8 months. I'd developed a specialized approach to their unique technical requirements and had scheduled a meeting with their CEO for the following week. "I didn't realize Natasha was involved in the Blackstone pitch," I said carefully. "She volunteered to help with the financial projections and ROI analysis. You know how much stronger those presentations are when we can speak their language about market positioning and competitive advantages." That night, I lay awake trying to understand why I felt so unsettled. On the surface, everything Richard said made sense. Natasha was proving to be an exceptional addition to our team. She was contributing valuable insights and helping us approach familiar challenges from new angles. Richard seemed energized and excited about work in ways I hadn't seen in years.
But something felt wrong. Maybe it was the way Natasha's ideas always seemed to require extensive private consultation with Richard. Maybe it was how she'd begun offering opinions on strategic decisions that traditionally fell under my technical expertise. Maybe it was the subtle shift in how Richard presented our ideas in meetings when I hadn't been part of developing them. Or maybe it was something simpler and more primal, the way Natasha looked at my husband during meetings, with an intensity that seemed to go beyond professional admiration. The way Richard's voice changed when he spoke to her, taking on a tone I recognized from our early dating days. The way they seemed to share inside jokes and unspoken communications that excluded everyone else in the room. I told myself I was being paranoid. Richard and I had built 30 years of trust and partnership. We were planning our future together, talking about retirement and legacy and growing old side by side. One impressive new employee couldn't possibly threaten the foundation we'd created. But late at night, staring at the ceiling while Richard slept peacefully beside me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was shifting in the carefully balanced world we'd constructed together. I just had no idea how quickly that shift would accelerate into an avalanche that would bury everything I thought I knew about my marriage and my business. By June 2023, the small changes I'd noticed in March had evolved into a completely different dynamic that I struggled to understand, let alone address. What had started as Richard's enthusiasm for a new team member had transformed into something that felt like a fundamental shift in our professional partnership and, increasingly, our marriage. The most obvious change was in our decision-making process. For 30 years, Richard and I had operated as true equals. Every major business decision was made together, usually after lengthy discussions where we'd examine problems from every possible angle. Suddenly, I found myself learning about significant choices after they'd already been implemented. "We've decided to restructure the client services department," Richard announced during our Monday morning senior staff meeting in late June. He clicked through a PowerPoint presentation that looked professionally polished and thoroughly researched. "Natasha has identified several inefficiencies in our current model that are costing us both time and revenue." I stared at the slides, recognizing none of the analysis or recommendations. "When was this decided?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral despite the shock. "Natasha and I have been working on this for the past 3 weeks. We wanted to have a complete proposal before bringing it to the team." 3 weeks? They'd spent 3 weeks developing a major organizational change without including me in a single conversation. The restructuring would affect 47 employees and fundamentally alter how we delivered services to our largest clients. Exactly the kind of decision we'd always made together. "I'd like to review the underlying data before we move forward," I said carefully. Natasha spoke up for the first time, her voice confident and slightly condescending. Of course, I'll send you the full analysis, though I should mention that Richard and I have already presented this to the board's executive committee. They've approved implementation beginning next month. The board's executive committee consisted of Richard's brother Harold, our CFO Patricia, and our largest outside investor, Marcus Thornfield. I wasn't on the executive committee, had never needed to be, since Richard and I always presented a unified front. But apparently, that unified front no longer existed. After the meeting, I cornered Richard in his office. Why wasn't I included in this decision? Client services interfaces directly with technical implementation. You can't restructure one without affecting the other. Meredith, I know you're used to being involved in everything, but we have to trust our team to handle their areas of expertise. Natasha has extensive experience in organizational efficiency from her Goldman days. This is exactly the kind of strategic thinking we hired her for. Her Goldman days were in investment banking, not consulting operations. And since when do I micromanage our strategic decisions? That's not what I meant, but his expression suggested it was exactly what he meant. Look, you're brilliant with the technical side, but business operations have always been more my wheelhouse. Maybe it's time we started playing more to our individual strengths. Individual strengths. As if 30 years of collaborative decision-making had been some kind of inefficient compromise rather than the foundation of our success. The changes accelerated after that conversation. Richard and Natasha began attending client meetings together while I focused on technical implementation. They developed new business proposals without my input, then presented them to me as fait accompli that required my team's execution. When I raised concerns or suggested modifications, I was told the client had already approved the approach and changes would be disruptive to the relationship. Our evening debriefings became increasingly one-sided. Richard would give me brief updates on his activities while showing little interest in mine. When I tried to discuss strategic concerns or new technical developments, he'd nod distractedly and change the subject to whatever project he and Natasha were working on.
She really understands the evolving marketplace, he'd say, with an enthusiasm that used to be reserved for my innovations. Her insights into client psychology are revolutionizing how we approach relationship management. The most painful part was watching our staff adapt to this new dynamic. Employees who had always brought complex problems to both of us started directing strategic questions exclusively to Richard. Technical team members began asking Natasha for approval on decisions that had previously been my domain. In meetings, people started looking to Richard for final authority, even when I was the one with the relevant expertise. Natasha had a particular talent for positioning herself as the bridge between Richard's business vision and my more limited understanding. Richard's thinking is that we need to streamline the client onboarding process, she'd say during project planning sessions. I think what he's envisioning is a more automated approach to the initial assessment phase. Meredith, could your team develop something that handles the routine technical evaluations so we can focus on the strategic relationship building? The implication was always clear. Richard was the visionary, she was the strategic interpreter, and I was the technical implementer. The fact that most of our strategic innovations were actually advanced applications of technologies I'd developed seemed to get lost in her presentations. By August, Richard had moved Natasha's office to the suite adjacent to his, claiming she needed more space for her expanding responsibilities. Her new title became Senior Strategic Advisor, with a salary that put her in the top tier of our compensation structure. When I questioned the rapid promotion, Richard explained that we needed to retain exceptional talent and invest in our future leadership. Our weekend mountain trip stopped. Richard claimed he was too busy with strategic initiatives to take time away from the office. Our no-business dinners became rare, then non-existent. When I suggested we needed to reconnect, he agreed in principle, but always had urgent projects that required his immediate attention. Once we get through this transition period, things will settle down, he'd promise. But the transition period kept extending, and the urgent projects multiplied. The worst part was the gaslighting, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. When I expressed frustration about being excluded from decisions, Richard would suggest I was being overly sensitive. When I pointed out that our partnership dynamic had changed, he'd remind me that growth required evolution and adaptation. When I mentioned feeling disconnected from him, he'd say I was imagining problems that didn't exist. "You're just stressed because the business is getting more complex," he'd say with a patronizing smile. "Maybe you should consider taking some time off. Natasha and I can handle the strategic planning while you recharge." The suggestion that I needed to step back while she stepped forward felt like a slap. I'd built this company. I'd developed the innovations that made us millions. I'd sacrificed weekends and vacations and personal time to create something extraordinary. And now, I was being told that I needed to recharge while a 28-year-old with an MBA took over strategic planning? But the most insidious part of the deterioration was how gradually it happened. Each individual change seemed reasonable when viewed in isolation. Richard working closely with a talented new team member, delegating more responsibilities as the company grew, allowing expertise to drive decision-making, streamlining our processes for efficiency. It was only when I stepped back and looked at the overall pattern that I could see what was really happening. I was being systematically marginalized in the company I'd co-founded. My role was being reduced to technical implementation, while the strategic direction, the vision and leadership I'd always shared, was being transferred to someone else. And the most devastating part was that the someone else was genuinely capable. Natasha wasn't incompetent or malicious in obvious ways. She was smart, strategic, and effective, which made it impossible to argue against her rising influence without sounding jealous or territorial. By September, I felt like a stranger in my own company, watching my husband of 30 years build a new partnership that didn't include me. October 2023 brought the kind of pressure that makes you question your own sanity. I found myself documenting conversations, taking screenshots of emails, and keeping detailed notes about decisions, not for any strategic purpose, but because I was starting to doubt my own memory of how things used to work. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine quarterly board meeting. I'd prepared my usual comprehensive technical report outlining our latest innovations, client satisfaction metrics, and development pipeline. For 15 years, this presentation had been the highlight of our board meetings, the moment when I demonstrated the technical superiority that kept us ahead of our competitors. I walked into the boardroom, expecting the familiar setup. Richard and I presenting together, fielding questions as a team, celebrating another successful quarter. Instead, I found Natasha sitting in what had always been my seat, with the laptop open and presentation materials spread across the table.
"Meredith, perfect timing," Richard said without looking up from his conversation with Harold. "Natasha's prepared an integrated strategic overview that covers both operational efficiency and technical developments. We thought it would be more streamlined than our usual separate presentations." Integrated strategic overview. My technical report had been absorbed into her presentation like a minor supporting document. I took a seat at the far end of the table, the spot usually reserved for junior staff or outside consultants, and watched Natasha deliver what was essentially my work repackaged with her strategic commentary. "The Hartwell Protocol continues to be our signature competitive advantage," she said confidently, clicking through slides that contained my technical diagrams overlaid with her business analysis. "However, I've identified several opportunities to expand its applications into emerging markets that we haven't fully explored." She spoke about my life's work like she'd invented it, casually suggesting improvements and optimizations that demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of the underlying technology. When board member Patricia Wells asked a technical question about implementation timelines, Natasha glanced at me expectantly.
Meredith can provide the detailed technical specifications, she said dismissively. But from a strategic perspective, I recommend we prioritize client-facing enhancements over back-end optimizations. I was being positioned as the technical support for her strategic vision. In a room full of people who'd watched me build this company from nothing, I was now the junior partner expected to provide detailed specifications for someone else's strategic recommendations. After the meeting, I cornered Richard in the parking garage. "What the hell was that?" "What do you mean?" His genuinely confused expression was almost worse than if he'd been deliberately cruel. My technical presentation was buried in her strategic overview. I looked like a junior developer providing support for her vision. "Meredith, you're being dramatic." The board was impressed with the integrated approach. They want to see leadership collaboration, not territorial silos. Territorial silos! As if 30 years of technical innovation was now territorial behavior that needed to be managed. Richard, she suggested modifications to the Hartwell protocol that would fundamentally break its core functionality. She doesn't understand the technology well enough to make those recommendations. Maybe that's exactly why we need her perspective. Sometimes being too close to the technical details prevents us from seeing bigger strategic opportunities. That night, I did something I'd never done in 30 years of marriage. I went through Richard's phone while he slept. I told myself I was looking for evidence of business decisions I'd been excluded from, but honestly, I was looking for evidence of the affair I was increasingly certain was happening. What I found was worse than explicit messages or romantic photos. I found a systematic documentation of my declining performance and resistance to strategic evolution. Screenshots of emails where I'd raised technical concerns about Natasha's suggestions, notes from conversations where I'd questioned new directions or asked to be included in planning sessions. All of it reframed as evidence that I was becoming a liability to the company's growth. One message chain between Richard and Harold made my blood run cold. Richard: "Meredith's pushback on the client services restructuring is becoming problematic. She's undermining Natasha's authority with the technical teams." Harold: "Is this about business strategy or personal jealousy?" Richard: "That's exactly the problem. I can't tell where legitimate technical concerns end and territorial behavior begins. Natasha thinks we need to consider whether Meredith's current role is sustainable long-term." Natasha thinks. As if a woman who'd been with our company for 7 months was qualified to evaluate whether one of its founders was sustainable long-term. I took pictures of the message chains with my own phone, though I wasn't sure what I planned to do with them. I just knew I needed evidence that I wasn't losing my mind, that there really was a campaign to push me out of my own company. The next few weeks brought an acceleration of the isolation. Richard and Natasha began traveling together to client sites, attending industry conferences as our senior leadership team. When I asked to join a particularly important client presentation in Chicago, I was told that the client had specifically requested a streamlined team, and bringing too many people might seem desperate. Natasha can handle the strategic overview, and if they have technical questions, we can conference you in. Conference me in to discuss my own innovations with clients I'd been building relationships with for years. I started staying late at the office, not because I had more work than usual, but because I was trying to understand what was happening to my company. I reviewed financial reports, organizational charts, and project timelines, looking for patterns that might explain how I'd become so peripheral to operations I'd designed. What I discovered was even more disturbing than Richard's messages. Natasha had been systematically building relationships with our key clients, positioning herself as their primary point of contact for strategic initiatives. She'd established regular check-in calls with CEOs and CFOs, ostensibly to ensure client satisfaction, but actually to build personal loyalty that bypassed both Richard and me.
More troubling, she'd been gathering detailed information about our proprietary methodologies, client contracts, and financial structures. Her access level to our systems was far beyond what any assistant or advisor should have.
Yet she'd somehow obtained permissions that let her review everything from intellectual property documentation to partnership agreements. When I brought this to Richard's attention, he dismissed my concerns with increasing irritation. She needs comprehensive access to do her job effectively. Strategic planning requires understanding all aspects of our operations. Richard, she's downloaded copies of our entire client database. She has access to salary information for our senior staff. This goes far beyond strategic planning. You're being paranoid. Natasha is trying to help us optimize our operations, and you're treating her like a corporate spy. Paranoid. The word stung because I was starting to feel paranoid. I was questioning conversations, second-guessing my own perceptions, and wondering if 30 years of successful business instincts had suddenly abandoned me. But late one evening in November, I discovered something that proved my instincts were absolutely correct. While working late on a client proposal, I accessed our shared server to retrieve some technical specifications and stumbled across a folder I'd never seen before, labeled Strategic Transition Planning. Inside were documents that made everything clear: detailed analyses of how to transfer my responsibilities to other team members, financial projections for operating without my salary and benefits, and most damning of all, a timeline for managing Meredith's departure while preserving client relationships and technical continuity. They weren't just marginalizing me, they were planning to fire me. And they'd been planning it since August, just months after Natasha's arrival. The folder contained email exchanges between Natasha, Richard, and the law firm Harrison, Burke & Associates. They'd been building a legal case for my removal, documenting every instance of pushback or disagreement as evidence of my inability to adapt to the company's evolving needs. I sat alone in my office at 11 o'clock at night, reading my professional obituary written by my husband and the woman who's replacing me in every aspect of my life. The company I'd built, the innovations I'd created, the relationships I'd cultivated, all of it was being prepared for transfer to someone who'd been here less than a year. But the most devastating document was a personal email from Richard to Natasha, sent just 2 days earlier. The divorce attorney confirmed that the prenup protects the business assets. Once we execute the board resolution, Meredith's shares transfer to the company treasury, and we can restructure ownership however we decide. She'll fight it, but without board support, she has no leverage. You've done an incredible job positioning yourself as the obvious successor. I couldn't have planned this better myself. Divorce attorney. Prenup. Successor. I wasn't just being pushed out of my company, I was being pushed out of my marriage. And it had all been planned with surgical precision by the woman I'd welcomed into our professional family and the man I'd trusted with my life. The boardroom coup unfolded exactly as I'd seen it planned in those stolen documents, but experiencing it in person was like watching my own execution in slow motion. I sat in that mahogany conference room on Tuesday morning, January 16th, 2024, surrounded by people I'd trusted for decades, and watched them systematically dismantle 30 years of my life. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent the previous 3 months preparing for this moment. While Richard and Natasha thought they were executing a perfect plan, I'd been building my own strategy, one they'd never see coming, because they'd made the fatal mistake of underestimating the woman who'd actually built the empire they were trying to steal. But knowing what was coming didn't make it hurt less when Harold cleared his throat and announced, "We're here to address serious concerns about the company's technical leadership and strategic direction." I maintained my composure as he outlined their case against me: resistance to innovation, undermining new leadership, inability to adapt to market changes. Each accusation was carefully documented, supported by emails and meeting notes taken out of context. They'd built a convincing narrative of a founder who'd outlived her usefulness, whose attachment to outdated methods was holding back a dynamic company's growth.
Natasha presented the technical assessment with surgical precision. She'd done her homework, identifying every client complaint, every delayed project, every budget overrun from the past 2 years. Never mind that most of those issues stem from unrealistic timelines she had imposed or scope changes she'd negotiated without consulting the technical team. Quote, "The Hartwell Protocol, while innovative in its time, is becoming a legacy system that limits our competitive flexibility," she explained to the board with confidence that made my teeth ache. Outdated assumptions. She was calling my life's work outdated to a room full of people who'd become millionaires because of that supposedly obsolete technology. Richard delivered the final blow with a performance worthy of a theater award. His voice cracked with apparent emotion as he spoke about the painful but necessary decision to remove me from operational responsibilities.
Meredith built something incredible, he said, actually managing to produce tears. But sometimes the very qualities that make someone a brilliant founder become obstacles to institutional growth. We owe it to our employees, our clients, and our shareholders to prioritize the company's future over personal sentiments. Personal sentiments. 30 years of marriage reduced to personal sentiments that were inconvenient for business decisions. Patricia Wells, the CFO I'd mentored from a junior accountant to a six-figure executive, wouldn't meet my eyes as she outlined the financial benefits of the transition. Harold spoke about legal protections and succession planning like he was discussing quarterly tax strategies, rather than destroying his brother's wife. The vote was unanimous, 7-0, to remove me from all operational roles, effective immediately. Then came the divorce papers. Natasha slipped them across the table with the same casual confidence she'd shown with the termination documents. Richard felt it was important to handle all the legal transitions simultaneously, she explained. Clean breaks are less disruptive for everyone involved. I opened the folder and saw 30 years of marriage reduced to asset divisions and custody arrangements. The prenuptial agreement I'd signed in 1994, back when we had nothing but dreams and basement rent, had been weaponized against the success we'd built together. According to the lawyers, my contributions to the company were considered marital support rather than foundational ownership, which meant Richard retained controlling interest while I received a generous settlement that amounted to roughly 5% of what the company was actually worth. "The house in Willowbrook is yours, of course," Richard said with magnanimous generosity, as if he was doing me a favor by letting me keep the home I co-designed and co-financed. "And there's a substantial cash settlement that should provide comfortable retirement security." Retirement security. At 59 years old, I was being pensioned off like an aging employee who'd served her purpose. But the most devastating moment came when I looked around that conference room and realized that every single person there believed they were doing the right thing. They'd bought into the narrative so completely that they genuinely saw this as necessary evolution rather than calculated betrayal. Richard had convinced them, possibly even convinced himself, that pushing out the company's co-founder was an act of corporate responsibility. "Do you have any questions about the transition timeline?" Natasha asked, with professional courtesy that felt like salt in an open wound. I closed the divorce papers and stood up slowly, gathering my purse and the dignity I had left. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the ventilation system and the distant sounds of downtown Ashford traffic 47 floors below. "Just one question," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside my chest. "Did any of you actually believe this was about the company's best interests, or did you all know this was about Richard wanting to fuck his secretary?" The collective gasp was audible. Patricia's hand flew to her mouth. Harold's face went red. Richard stood up so fast his chair rolled backward into the wall. "Meredith, that's completely inappropriate."
Inappropriate? I laughed, and the sound came out sharper than I intended. Let's talk about inappropriate. Let's talk about the expense reports showing your weekend trips to Chicago when we don't have any Chicago clients. Let's discuss the corporate credit card charges for jewelry and lingerie. Or maybe we should review the hotel receipts for rooms booked under your name with Miss Crowley as your guest. Natasha's composed mask slipped for the first time since I'd known her. Those were legitimate business expenses. Business expenses. I pulled out my phone and opened the photos I'd taken of Richard's messages. Should I read the text where you called me the old bitch who needs to be handled carefully until the paperwork is final? Or the one where Richard promised to buy you a new BMW once the divorce settlement was complete? The silence in the room was deafening. Harold stared at his brother with something approaching horror. Patricia was frantically taking notes like she was documenting evidence for future legal proceedings. Richard's face had gone from red to white. Meredith, you're obviously upset, but making accusations? I'm not making accusations. I'm stating facts. Facts I've documented, photographed, and had verified by my own team of investigators. You want to know what's inappropriate? A CFO who didn't notice $47,000 in unauthorized personal expenses over the past 6 months? A board that approved the termination of a co-founder without reviewing her actual performance metrics versus the doctored reports you were provided? A husband who hired divorce attorneys before he bothered to tell his wife their marriage was over. I walked toward the door, then turned back for my final statement. You all seem to think you've executed some brilliant corporate strategy. But here's something none of you considered. I didn't just help build this company. I built the systems that run it. I designed the protocols that protect it. I created the client relationships that sustain it. And I've been documenting everything you've done to steal it from me. Natasha found her voice first. Are you threatening us?
I smiled at her with genuine warmth. Oh, sweetie, I'm not threatening you. I'm promising you. By the end of this week, you'll understand the difference between being a strategic advisor and being a strategic genius. Richard's about to learn that the woman who built a $200 million company from nothing isn't going to disappear quietly into retirement. I paused at the door for one final observation. Also, Natasha, the Hartwell Protocol isn't just our technical framework, it's the foundation of every contract we have. Every client agreement, every service-level commitment, every competitive advantage we've built over 15 years is protected by intellectual property laws that I made sure to register under my name. You want to call it outdated? Go ahead. Just remember that outdated or not, I own it. The look of dawning horror on their faces was almost worth 30 years of betrayal. Almost. I walked out of Meridian Technologies for what I assumed would be the last time, my heels clicking against the marble floors with a rhythm that sounded like a countdown timer. They thought they'd destroyed me. What they'd actually done was unleash me. I drove straight from Meridian Technologies to the law offices of Blackstone, Carter & Associates, the most aggressive corporate litigation firm in the state, and more importantly, the primary competitor to Harrison, Burke & Associates, the firm Richard had hired to orchestrate my destruction. If he wanted to play legal hardball, I was going to show him what championship level looked like. The receptionist at Blackstone seemed surprised when I walked in without an appointment, demanding to speak with Margaret Blackstone herself. I'm sorry, Miss Blackstone is in meetings all afternoon. Perhaps one of our junior partners? Tell her that Meredith Hartwell is here about intellectual property theft, corporate malfeasance, and a case that will make her career, I said calmly. If she's too busy for a $200 million lawsuit, I'll take my business to Morrison and Reed. Margaret Blackstone herself appeared in the lobby within 5 minutes. She was exactly what I'd hoped for, sharp-eyed, impeccably dressed, and carrying herself with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a case she cared about winning. Her reputation for dismantling corporate executives who underestimated her was legendary in Ashford's business community. Mrs. Hartwell, she said, extending a firm handshake, I've been following your work for years. What can I do for you?
I need to destroy my husband professionally, legally, and financially. And I need to do it in a way that's completely legal, thoroughly documented, and absolutely devastating. Her smile was predatory. I think we should talk. For the next 3 hours, I laid out everything. The systematic exclusion from my own company, the affair with Natasha, the financial improprieties, the planned divorce designed to steal my life's work. I showed her screenshots of Richard's messages, copies of the unauthorized expenses, documentation of the meetings I'd been excluded from, and most importantly, the intellectual property registrations that proved I owned the technology that made Meridian Technologies valuable. "This is almost too easy," Margaret said, reviewing the evidence. "They've made every mistake possible. The unauthorized expenses alone are grounds for corporate fraud charges. The intellectual property theft could result in criminal penalties. And the way they've documented their conspiracy, it's like they wanted to get caught." "I don't want them caught," I corrected her. "I want them ruined. There's a difference." "What exactly are you looking for as an outcome?" I'd been thinking about this question since November, refining my strategy as I gathered evidence. I want full ownership of Meridian Technologies. I want Richard and Natasha barred from the industry. I want the board members who voted against me held financially liable for their breach of fiduciary duty. And I want it all done so publicly that no one in the consulting business will ever make the mistake of underestimating me again. Her eyes lit up. "Now that's a worthy challenge. But you understand this will be expensive, time-consuming, and absolutely brutal for everyone involved, including you. Mrs. Blackstone, I spent 30 years building something beautiful with someone I trusted completely. He destroyed it in 7 months to satisfy his ego and his libido. I'm not looking for justice. I'm looking for annihilation." The next stop was Ashford First National Bank, where I'd maintained our personal and business accounts for over 2 decades. I walked into the private banking office and requested an immediate meeting with James Morrison, the senior vice president who'd handled our major transactions for years. "Meredith, what a pleasant surprise! How can I help you today?" "James, I need to understand something about the corporate accounts for Meridian Technologies. Specifically, I need to know if my signatures are still required for major financial decisions." His expression grew cautious. "Well, according to our records, you're still listed as a primary account holder with full access and authorization requirements for transactions over $50,000. Perfect. Richard and Natasha had been so focused on removing me from operational control that they'd forgotten about financial control. Every major expense, every payroll transfer, every client payment, it all required my signature or electronic authorization. "James, I'm going to need you to freeze all account activity pending a corporate restructuring. No transfers, no major expenses, no payroll processing without written authorization from me personally."
Meredith, that would essentially shut down your company's operations. It's not my company anymore, James. As of this morning, I was terminated from Meridian Technologies. But apparently, they forgot to remove my financial authorities before they fired me. I'd like to help them understand that oversight. James's face went pale as he realized the implications. "This is highly irregular. I should probably contact Richard." "You should probably contact your legal department," I interrupted, "because what you're going to find is that I have every legal right to freeze these accounts. And if you don't comply with my request, you'll be facilitating corporate fraud." Within an hour, every Meridian Technologies account was frozen. No payroll, no expense payments, no operational funds. The company that had fired me that morning was effectively shut down by lunchtime. My phone started ringing immediately. First Richard, then Harold, then Patricia, then board members whose names I didn't recognize. I let every call go to voicemail, then listened to the messages with satisfaction that felt like warm wine. "Meredith, what the hell are you doing? You can't just freeze our accounts." Richard's voice was panicked, desperate. "People aren't getting paid. We have client obligations." The next message was from Harold. "This is corporate sabotage, Meredith. We'll have you arrested."
Then Patricia, please just call me back. We can work this out. Finally, a message from Margaret Blackstone. They've already contacted Harrison Burke and Associates. Their lawyer wants to schedule an emergency hearing. I told them we'd be delighted to discuss this in court, where all the evidence would become public record. Funny how quickly they wanted to negotiate instead. That evening, I sat in the kitchen of my Willowbrook house, the house Richard had so generously allowed me to keep, and made a list of everyone who worked at Meridian Technologies. 307 employees, most of whom had families, mortgages, and bills that depended on their paychecks. Good people who didn't deserve to suffer because their executives were corrupt. I spent 2 hours crafting individual emails to every department head, team leader, and senior staffer. The message was simple. Richard and Natasha had engaged in corporate malfeasance that made continued employment dangerous for everyone involved. I was prepared to discuss alternative employment arrangements for anyone interested in working for a new company built on actual integrity rather than backroom deals and extramarital affairs. My phone rang at 11:47 p.m. Richard's number. Hello, Richard. Meredith, please, you're destroying people's lives. Sarah Chen has a newborn baby. Marcus Thompson just bought a house. These people depend on us. They depend on Meridian Technologies, I corrected. The company you and your 28-year-old girlfriend just stole from me. I'm not destroying their lives. I'm offering them a chance to work for someone who won't screw them over the moment it becomes convenient. What do you want? The question I'd been waiting for. I want a meeting. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., at the Copper Kettle Diner on 5th Street. Just you and me, no lawyers, no board members, and definitely no Natasha. Fine, but Meredith, you have to understand. I don't have to understand anything, Richard. You made your choices. Now you get to live with the consequences. I hung up and poured myself a glass of the expensive wine Richard had bought to celebrate our 30th anniversary. It tasted like victory and vinegar, but I drank it anyway. Tomorrow, I would begin teaching my husband and his mistress the difference between stealing a company and earning one. The woman they'd tried to pension off was about to remind them why she built a $200 million empire in the first place. Richard arrived at the Copper Kettle Diner at exactly 9 a.m., looking like he'd aged 5 years in the past 24 hours. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of a sleepless night. He slid into the booth across from me, the same booth where we'd planned our future 35 years ago, and I felt nothing but cold satisfaction at his obvious distress. The employees haven't been paid, Meredith. Payroll was supposed to process yesterday. I know. Funny how quickly a company stops functioning when you don't have access to operating funds. This isn't about the employees, Meredith. They don't deserve to suffer because of our personal problems. Our personal problems? I set down my coffee cup with deliberate precision. Richard and your 28-year-old girlfriend systematically planned to steal my company and end my marriage. That's not a personal problem. That's corporate fraud and conspiracy. He leaned forward, desperation creeping into his voice. What do you want? Just tell me what you want and let's end this. I pulled out a folder containing the settlement terms Margaret Blackstone and I had spent until 2 a.m. perfecting. Full ownership transfer of Meridian Technologies to me, including all assets, intellectual property, and client contracts. Immediate resignation of both you and Natasha, with a signed non-compete agreement preventing either of you from working in the consulting industry for 5 years. Personal reimbursement of $127,000 in unauthorized corporate expenses, and a public apology acknowledging your breach of fiduciary duty.
Richard's face went white as he read the terms. This is insane. You're asking for everything. I'm taking back what was always mine, I corrected. The company was built on my innovations, my client relationships, and my 30 years of expertise. You want to walk away with Natasha? Fine, but you don't get to take my life's work with you. The board will never approve this. Harold will fight you every step of the way. I smiled. Harold should worry more about his own legal exposure.
As a board member who approved financial irregularities without proper oversight, he's facing personal liability for breach of fiduciary duty. Margaret Blackstone is very excited to explain that to him in court. And if I refuse, then I'll see you in court, where everything becomes public record. Every text message, every financial document, every hotel receipt. Your affair with Natasha will be front-page news in the business journal. The unauthorized expenses will become criminal charges. And when I'm done, neither of you will be employable anywhere in corporate America. Richard stared at the settlement terms for a long moment, then looked up at me with something approaching respect. When did you become so ruthless? I learned from watching my husband destroy a 30-year marriage for a woman young enough to be his daughter. It's amazing what betrayal can teach you about priorities. He signed the papers. But winning the first battle didn't end the war. Over the next 6 weeks, Richard and Natasha tested my resolve in ways I hadn't anticipated, forcing me to prove that my threats weren't empty posturing. The first challenge came from Harold, who filed an emergency injunction claiming I was acting outside my legal authority in freezing the accounts. Margaret Blackstone destroyed his case in less than an hour, presenting evidence of the systematic fraud that made the board's approval of my termination legally invalid. Your Honor, Margaret Hartwell isn't freezing accounts as a terminated employee. She's protecting assets as the majority intellectual property owner whose technology was being stolen by conspirators who documented their illegal activities in corporate emails. Harold's lawyer tried to argue that the board vote superseded my property rights, but Margaret simply presented Richard's text messages planning the divorce strategy and Natasha's emails about managing Meredith's departure. The judge not only upheld my account freeze, but ordered a full investigation into the board's conduct. The second challenge was more personal. Natasha began a whisper campaign throughout Ashford's business community, suggesting that I was an unstable woman having a breakdown who was using the legal system to punish my husband's legitimate business decisions. She was smart about it, never saying anything actionable, just raising concerns about my emotional state and vindictive behavior to anyone who would listen. Within weeks, I was receiving calls from longtime professional contacts expressing concern about my well-being and suggesting I might want to take some time to heal before making major business decisions. Margaret advised me to ignore the campaign, but I had a better idea. I scheduled lunch meetings with 15 of Ashford's most influential business leaders, CEOs, board members, and industry veterans who'd known me for decades. At each lunch, I presented the same materials: the financial evidence of Richard and Natasha's fraud, the timeline of their systematic exclusion of me from my own company, and the intellectual property documentation proving my ownership of Meridian's core technologies. I want you to know the facts, I told each of them, because there's going to be a lot of noise in the coming months. When you hear stories about my emotional stability or vindictive behavior, I want you to remember that the unstable woman sitting across from you just outmaneuvered a board of directors who thought they could steal a $200 million company. The whisper campaign died within a week. Business leaders started calling to congratulate me on handling a difficult situation with impressive strategic thinking. 2 of them offered me consulting contracts on the spot. The third challenge was the most serious. Natasha attempted to poach our largest clients by claiming that my departure would disrupt service quality and suggesting they should consider transitioning to more stable consulting partnerships. She'd scheduled meetings with the CEOs of our top 5 accounts, armed with presentations about continuity of service and leadership transitions. What she didn't know was that I'd spent 30 years building personal relationships with these executives that went far beyond corporate contracts. I called each CEO personally. David, I said to David Peterson, CEO of Davidson Industries, our largest account, I understand you're meeting with Natasha Crowley about potential service disruptions. I wanted you to hear directly from me what's actually happening. Meredith, good to hear your voice. Yes, she reached out with some concerns about operational continuity. Should I be worried? Not at all. The company is going through a leadership transition, but I'm still here and all of our service commitments remain unchanged. In fact, I'm now in a position to give your account the personal attention it deserves. Would you like me to present our new strategic direction for your consideration?
By the end of the week, all 5 clients had not only reconfirmed their contracts, but had agreed to expanded service agreements worth an additional $8.3 million in annual revenue. Natasha's poaching attempt had backfired spectacularly, actually strengthening my position. The final test came when Richard made one last desperate play. He filed a counter-lawsuit claiming that I was violating the prenuptial agreement by using community property, the business, to punish him for personal decisions, the affair. Margaret laughed when she read the filing. This is exactly what we wanted him to do. How is that good news? Because now he's officially claiming that Meridian Technologies is community property, which means he's acknowledging that your contributions to the company were foundational, not just supportive. He just invalidated his own argument for why you should only get a small settlement. The counter-lawsuit lasted exactly 3 days before Harrison, Burke & Associates quietly withdrew it, and Richard's lawyer resigned from the case, claiming irreconcilable differences in legal strategy. By March 2024, 2 months after the boardroom coup, I owned Meridian Technologies outright. Richard and Natasha had both signed the resignations and non-compete agreements. The board had been restructured with new members who actually understood their fiduciary responsibilities, and the company was operating more efficiently than it had in years. But the most satisfying moment came when I received a call from Northwestern University's business school, where Natasha had earned her MBA. Mrs. Hartwell, we've been following the case in the business media. We'd like to invite you to give a guest lecture to our students about corporate governance and ethical leadership. I accepted immediately, because there's nothing quite like teaching the next generation of business leaders about the consequences of underestimating a woman who built her empire from nothing. The real transformation began in April 2024, when I realized that winning back my company was just the beginning. The past 3 months had taught me something unexpected. I was better at running Meridian Technologies alone than I had ever been as part of Richard's partnership. Without his constant need for consensus and Natasha's strategic interference, I could move at the speed of innovation rather than the pace of committee approval. The first sign of this new dynamic came during our quarterly all-hands meeting. For years, these gatherings had been formal presentations where Richard handled the business overview while I discussed technical developments. Now, standing alone at the front of our main conference room, addressing 307 employees who'd watched their company nearly implode, I felt a clarity of purpose I hadn't experienced in years. I know the past few months have been uncertain, I began, looking out at faces that ranged from worried to curious to openly skeptical. You've seen leadership changes, financial freezes, and probably heard rumors about everything from corporate fraud to personal vendettas. I want to address all of that directly. I clicked to the first slide of my presentation, our financial performance over the past decade, with a clear line showing how our most innovative and profitable years had coincided with my technical leadership, rather than recent strategic initiatives. The truth is simple. We lost our way. We started chasing market trends instead of setting them. We began following other companies' innovations instead of creating our own. We got distracted by reorganizations and efficiency consultants when we should have been focused on what made us successful in the first place, solving problems that other people said were impossible. Marcus Thompson, our senior systems architect, raised his hand. What does that mean for our current projects? Some of the client commitments we made under the previous structure are ambitious. I smiled. Marcus was one of the employees I'd been most worried about losing. Brilliant, ethical, and completely uninterested in corporate politics. His question told me that he was thinking about solutions rather than looking for an exit. It means we're going back to what we do best. Every project gets evaluated based on one criteria. Does it showcase technology that advances our industry, or is it just expensive consulting that anyone could provide? If it's the latter, we're either redesigning it or canceling it. Sarah Chen, our youngest team leader, looked up from her notes. What about the efficiency metrics Natasha implemented? The productivity tracking and billable hour requirements? Gone, I said immediately. Effective today. I'm not interested in measuring how many hours you work. I'm interested in measuring how many problems you solve. Some of our best innovations have come from people who spent weeks thinking about a single challenge, not from people racing to hit arbitrary productivity targets. The room's energy shifted palpably. I could see shoulders relaxing, expressions brightening, the kind of collective exhale that happens when people realize they can stop pretending to be something they're not. But the real test of our new direction came 2 weeks later when Davidson Industries approached us with a challenge that would have been impossible under the old structure. Their CEO, David Peterson, called me personally with a problem that had stumped 3 other consulting firms.
Meredith, we need to integrate 5 different manufacturing systems across 3 countries, all running on incompatible software platforms, and make them communicate in real time. Our current consultants keep telling us it's too complex, that we need to standardize on one platform first, but that would cost us 6 months of downtime we can't afford. Under Richard and Natasha's leadership, we would have proposed a comprehensive study period, followed by a phased implementation plan that prioritized minimizing risk over maximizing innovation. Safe, billable, and ultimately forgettable. Instead, I told David I'd have a solution proposal within 72 hours. I assembled a team of our 8 most creative technical minds and locked us in the conference room with enough coffee and takeout food to sustain a small army. Instead of focusing on why the integration was impossible, we focused on what it would look like if it worked perfectly. Forget about compatibility, I told the team. Assume we can make any system talk to any other system. What would the ideal workflow look like from the user's perspective? Elena Rodriguez, one of our software architects, started sketching on the whiteboard. If we could create a universal translation layer that sits between the manufacturing systems and the user interface, yes, interrupted James Park from our AI development team, and if we could train machine learning algorithms to predict integration conflicts before they happen, we could build a self-healing network, one that automatically routes around problems and optimizes itself based on real-world performance data. 71 hours later, we had designed something that had never been attempted before. A real-time manufacturing integration system that would not only solve Davidson's immediate problem, but could be adapted for any multi-platform industrial environment. It was ambitious to the point of being audacious, technically complex beyond anything we'd previously attempted, and exactly the kind of project that would establish us as the undisputed leaders in our field. David Peterson's reaction when I presented the proposal was everything I'd hoped for. This isn't just solving our problem, this is revolutionizing how modern manufacturing works. How quickly can you start? The Davidson Industries project became our proof of concept for everything Meridian Technologies could be when we stopped playing it safe. Over the next 6 months, our team worked with an intensity and creativity that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with technology in the first place. Every challenge spawned 3 new innovations. Every solution opened doors to possibilities we hadn't imagined. But more importantly, word spread throughout the industry that Meridian was no longer just another consulting firm. We were the company that took on impossible projects and made them work. By September, we had inquiries from companies across the globe wanting to know if we could solve their impossible problems. The European Aerospace Consortium asked if we could create a unified testing protocol for international aircraft certification. A pharmaceutical company wanted to know if we could develop a system that would track drug trials across 14 countries in real time. A financial services firm challenged us to build a fraud detection system that could identify patterns no human analyst would ever notice. Each project pushed us further into uncharted territory, and each success brought us clients who were willing to pay premium rates for solutions that simply couldn't be found anywhere else. Our revenue doubled, then tripled. Our profit margins went from industry standard to industry leading to completely unprecedented. More importantly, our employee satisfaction scores reached levels that attracted attention from business schools wanting to study our company culture. The transformation wasn't just financial, it was philosophical.
We had stopped trying to compete with other consulting firms and started creating an entirely new category of technological innovation. Our competitors were scrambling to copy approaches we already moved beyond. In October, I received a call that confirmed we'd achieved something remarkable. It was from Janet Morrison, CEO of Morrison & Reed, one of the most prestigious consulting firms in the country, and a company that had never acknowledged our existence during the Richard years. Marineth, I have a proposition for you. We have a client with a problem that's beyond our capabilities, and frankly, beyond anyone's capabilities except yours. Would you be interested in a joint venture that could reshape how our entire industry approaches complex systems integration? A joint venture with Morrison & Reed? The kind of partnership that would have been unthinkable when Richard was positioning us as a regional player trying to compete for standard consulting contracts. I'm listening. We're talking about a 5-year, $50 million project that would essentially create the technological infrastructure for smart cities of the future. The client wants to start with 3 pilot cities and expand globally if the pilot succeeds. They've specifically requested Meridian as the technical lead because, and I quote, "Nobody else is even attempting the kind of innovation we need." $50 million. Global expansion, technology that would shape the future of urban development. 2 years ago, I was fighting to keep my voice heard in strategic planning meetings. Now I was being asked to lead projects that would define the next decade of technological advancement. When do we start? I asked.
The Smart Cities project launched in January 2025, exactly 1 year after the boardroom coup that was supposed to end my career. Instead of attending Richard's retirement party as the discarded ex-wife of a successful businessman, I found myself standing in the lobby of the United Nations building in New York, waiting to present our urban technology framework to representatives from 47 countries. The irony wasn't lost on me. Richard used to joke that my technical focus was too narrow for global impact. Now I was literally reshaping how the world thought about urban infrastructure. Dr. Amelia Singh, the UN's Director of Sustainable Development, greeted me with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for rock stars. Mrs. Hartwell, your work on real-time city systems integration is exactly what we've been searching for. The pilot programs in Austin, Barcelona, and Singapore have exceeded every projection. The 3 pilot cities had become showcases of what was possible when technology served human needs rather than corporate efficiency metrics. Traffic flowed smoothly through AI-optimized routing systems. Energy consumption dropped by 35% through predictive grid management. Emergency response times improved by 60% through integrated communication networks. Most importantly, citizens reported higher satisfaction with city services across every measurable category. The results speak for themselves, I replied, settling into the conference room where ministers and mayors waited to hear about expanding the program to their cities. But what I'm most proud of is that we achieved these improvements while making the technology completely invisible to the people using it. The best innovation doesn't force people to adapt, it adapts to serve people better. The presentation went flawlessly. By the end of the day, we had commitments for pilot programs in 12 additional cities across 4 continents, with a total contract value that would make Meridian Technologies one of the largest consulting firms in the world. But the personal victory came 3 days later when I was having dinner with Margaret Blackstone at her favorite restaurant in Manhattan. We were celebrating the UN contracts when she showed me an article from that morning's business journal. The headline read, "The Rise and Fall of Richard Hartwell, a case study in strategic miscalculation." "This is brutal," Margaret said with evident satisfaction. "Listen to this. Industry analysts now recognize that Hartwell's decision to remove his wife from Meridian Technologies represents one of the most costly strategic errors in recent consulting history. While Meredith Hartwell has transformed the company into a global technology leader, Richard Hartwell and former associate Natasha Crowley have struggled to find employment in an industry that views their actions as a cautionary tale about the dangers of personal ambition overriding business judgment." I scanned the article, noting quotes from executives I'd known for decades.
David Peterson from Davidson Industries was particularly direct. Anyone who worked with both Richard and Meredith could see that she was the strategic visionary. Richard was a good business manager, but Meredith was the one who saw opportunities no one else recognized. Forcing her out was like Ford firing Henry Ford to promote a junior sales manager. The article went on to detail Richard and Natasha's current situation. Despite their non-compete agreements expiring, neither had been able to secure positions with reputable firms. The consulting industry, it turned out, was smaller and more interconnected than they had realized. Word of their corporate malfeasance had followed them to every interview, every networking event, every potential opportunity. Richard was reportedly working as a freelance business coach for small companies, a dramatic fall from running a $200 million corporation. Natasha had left consulting entirely and was working in retail management in another state, trying to rebuild her reputation far from Ashford's business community. The best part, Margaret continued reading, is this quote from Northwestern University's business school. We've made the Hartwell case a required study in our ethics curriculum. It demonstrates how personal corruption can destroy not just individual careers, but entire organizational cultures. Our students now understand that real leadership means putting institutional success ahead of personal gratification. My alma mater was using Richard's betrayal as a teaching tool about the consequences of unethical leadership. The poetic justice was almost overwhelming. But the most meaningful recognition came the following month when I received an invitation that would have been unimaginable 2 years earlier. The International Association of Technology Consultants wanted to present me with their Lifetime Achievement Award at their annual conference in Geneva. This award recognizes individuals who have fundamentally transformed our industry through innovation, leadership, and ethical excellence. Your work has not only advanced the technical capabilities of consulting services, but has demonstrated how principled leadership can drive both business success and positive social impact. The ceremony was attended by over 2,000 consulting professionals from around the world. As I walked to the podium to accept the award, I thought about the woman who had sat in that boardroom 13 months ago, watching her life's work stolen by people she'd trusted. That woman had been devastated, betrayed, and broken. But she'd also been underestimated.
When I started my career 36 years ago, I began my acceptance speech. I thought success meant building something valuable and protecting it from outside threats. I've learned that real success means building something so strong, so innovative, and so essential that it can survive any betrayal and emerge even more powerful. The audience was silent, hanging on every word. I've also learned that the most dangerous threats to any organization come from people who prioritize personal advancement over institutional integrity. But here's what I want every young consultant in this room to understand. Ethical leadership isn't just morally correct, it's strategically superior. When you build your career on competence rather than politics, on innovation rather than manipulation, on service rather than self-interest, you create something that can't be stolen or corrupted. The standing ovation lasted for nearly 5 minutes. After the ceremony, dozens of young consultants approached me with questions about building ethical businesses, managing complex technical projects, and navigating industry challenges. Many of them were women who saw my story as proof that competence and integrity could triumph over any obstacle. One young woman, maybe 25 years old, waited until the crowd had dispersed before approaching. "Mrs. Hartwell, I just wanted to thank you. I'm starting my own consulting firm next year, and I've been worried about competing with more established companies. Your story convinced me that innovation and ethics can be competitive advantages, not just moral choices." "What's your area of focus?" I asked. "Environmental sustainability systems. I want to help companies reduce their carbon footprint through intelligent automation." I handed her my business card. "Call me next week. Meridian is always looking for partners who prioritize substance over style, and the world needs more consultants who understand that technology should serve humanity, not the other way around." That evening, I sat in my hotel room overlooking Lake Geneva, reviewing emails from clients, partners, and colleagues around the world.
The company I'd nearly lost had become something far greater than what Richard and I had built together. We'd been successful, but we'd also been limited by his need for conventional respectability and safe, incremental growth. Now, unencumbered by anyone else's vision of what was possible, Meridian Technologies had become exactly what I dreamed it could be. A company that solved problems others were afraid to attempt, that created technologies that improved people's lives, and that proved ethical leadership was not just compatible with business success, it was essential to achieving greatness. My phone buzzed with a text message from Elena Rodriguez, our Chief Innovation Officer. The Tokyo Smart City proposal was approved. They want to start implementation in 6 months. This could be our biggest project yet. I smiled and typed back, "Excellent. Schedule a team meeting for Monday. We're going to change how the world thinks about urban living." 2 years and 8 months after Richard walked into our boardroom and tried to erase me from my own life story, I found myself back in that same conference room. But everything had changed. The mahogany table was the same. The floor-to-ceiling windows still offered the same view of downtown Ashford, but the women sitting at the head of the table bore little resemblance to the one who'd been humiliated here in January 2024. Today's meeting was with the leadership team of Meridian Global, the international expansion of our company that now employed over 1,200 people across 15 countries. We were discussing our acquisition of 2 European consulting firms and the launch of our African Development Initiative, projects that would have been impossible to imagine under the old structure. The Johannesburg office is ahead of schedule on the water management project, reported James Park, now our Chief Technology Officer. The city government is so impressed with the preliminary results that they're asking us to expand the program to Cape Town and Durban. Elena Rodriguez, our Chief Innovation Officer, added, "The Barcelona team has completed the energy grid optimization ahead of deadline. They're reporting a 42% reduction in waste, which exceeds our most optimistic projections." I looked around the table at faces that represented the company we'd become. Brilliant, diverse, ethical, and absolutely committed to using technology to solve problems that mattered. None of this would have been possible if Richard and Natasha had succeeded in their coup. They'd been planning to turn Meridian into a conventional consulting firm focused on billable hours and safe, incremental projects. Instead, their betrayal had forced me to discover what the company could become when guided by vision rather than fear, by innovation rather than imitation. "There's something else I want to discuss," I said, pulling out a folder I'd been preparing for weeks. "I've been thinking about succession planning." The room went quiet. At 61, I was at the peak of my career, leading a company that was reshaping entire industries. But I'd learned something important from watching Richard's downfall. Holding on to power too long corrupts even the best intentions. "I'm not retiring," I clarified, seeing the concerned expressions around the table, "but I am evolving my role. Over the next 2 years, I want to transition from operational leadership to strategic advisory. James, Elena, Marcus, Sarah, you've all proven you can lead this company better than one person ever could."
Marcus Thompson, our Chief Operations Officer, leaned forward. "Meredith, this company exists because of your vision. Are you sure this is the right time?" "Marcus, this company exists because we've built something bigger than any individual vision. The best leaders know when to step back and let their teams surpass them." I opened the folder and distributed copies of the succession plan I'd developed with Margaret Blackstone and our board. Unlike the hostile takeover Richard had attempted, this was a carefully planned transition designed to preserve our culture while empowering the next generation of leaders. The structure is simple. I'll remain as Executive Chair and Chief Innovation Strategist, focusing on long-term vision and new technology development. James will become CEO, Elena will expand her role to Chief Strategy Officer, and will promote from within to fill every other position. No outside hires, no dramatic restructuring, no ego-driven power plays. Sarah Chen, now our youngest vice president at 29, raised her hand. "What about the Hartwell Protocol? That's still the foundation of everything we do." I smiled. The Hartwell Protocol was never about me. It was about creating technology that adapts to serve human needs.
You've all improved it, expanded it, and applied it in ways I never imagined. It belongs to all of us now." The meeting continued for another hour, working through details and timelines. But the real business was already settled. Meridian Global would continue to thrive because we'd built it on principles rather than personalities, on shared vision rather than individual ambition. After everyone left, I sat alone in the conference room where my professional life had nearly ended. Through the windows, I could see the city we'd helped transform with smart traffic systems, optimized energy grids, and integrated emergency services. Ashford had become a model for urban innovation, largely because a woman who'd been fired from her own company had refused to accept defeat. My phone rang. Margaret Blackstone's name appeared on the screen. "I just got a fascinating call," she said without preamble. "Richard's lawyer wants to schedule a meeting. Apparently, he has a business proposal he'd like to discuss with you." I almost laughed. "What kind of proposal?" "He's developed some kind of consulting methodology he thinks might interest you." His lawyer was very vague, but the implication was that Richard believes his experience could be valuable to Meridian's continued growth. The audacity was breathtaking. The man who tried to steal my company now wanted to sell me his expertise? "Set up the meeting. I'm curious to see what he thinks he has to offer." "Are you sure? There's no legal obligation to hear him out." "Meredith, 2 years ago, I thought Richard's betrayal was the worst thing that could happen to me. Now I know it was the best thing. I'm not afraid of anything he might say." The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at Margaret's office, neutral ground with legal witnesses. I arrived early and spent a few minutes reviewing Richard's current situation. The private investigator's report made for depressing reading. Mounting debts, failed business ventures, and a reputation so damaged that even small companies were reluctant to hire him. Natasha, according to the report, had moved to Oregon and was working as an operations manager for a mid-size retail chain. She dropped the corporate persona entirely, apparently preferring anonymity to the public humiliation that followed her everywhere in the consulting world. Richard arrived exactly on time, and the change in him was startling. The confident executive I'd married had been replaced by a man who looked decades older than his 63 years. His suit was decent, but not expensive. His hair had more gray than I remembered, and there was a desperation in his eyes that made me feel something I hadn't expected. Pity. "Meredith," he said, his voice softer than I'd heard it in years, "thank you for agreeing to see me." "What do you want, Richard?" He pulled out a presentation folder with trembling hands. "I've spent the past year developing a business ethics framework based on everything I learned from what happened between us. I think it could be valuable for companies trying to avoid the mistakes I made." I stared at him. "You want to sell me a consulting program about business ethics?" I know how it sounds, but Meredith, I've talked to dozens of executives who are struggling with the same issues I faced. Balancing personal desires with professional responsibilities, managing workplace relationships, making decisions under pressure. My experience, as painful as it was, could help other people avoid destroying their lives the way I destroyed mine. The presentation was actually thoughtful. Richard had clearly spent significant time analyzing his own failures, identifying decision points where different choices might have led to different outcomes. It was the work of someone who genuinely understood the magnitude of his mistakes. But it was also irrelevant. "Richard, you're trying to monetize your failure. That's not wisdom. That's just another form of exploitation."
I'm sure you have. But learning from your mistakes doesn't entitle you to profit from them. If you really want to help other executives avoid your errors, write a book, give free lectures, volunteer with business ethics organizations. Don't try to build a consulting practice on the wreckage of our marriage. He sat in silence for a long moment, then closed his presentation folder. "You're right. I suppose I'm still trying to find shortcuts to success." Richard, you had success. You helped build something remarkable, and you threw it away for reasons I'll never understand. But that doesn't mean your life is over. It just means you need to find a different path, One that's based on actually serving others rather than serving yourself. He nodded slowly. For what it's worth, I am proud of what you've accomplished. I see the articles, the awards, the recognition. You've become everything I always knew you could be. I became everything I always was, I corrected. I just stopped letting other people define my limitations. After he left, I sat in Margaret's office thinking about the strange journey that had brought me to this moment. 2 years ago, I'd been a woman whose life was defined by partnership, collaboration, and shared decision-making. I'd been content to be half of something successful, rather than wholly myself. Richard's betrayal had forced me to discover who I actually was when stripped of everything I thought I needed. The answer surprised me. I was someone capable of building something greater than anything I'd ever imagined possible. That evening, I stood in my home office, the same room where I'd once planned strategy sessions with Richard, working on my acceptance speech for next month's Harvard Business School Distinguished Alumni Award. The invitation had come with a note from the dean. Your career demonstrates that the most powerful business strategy is unwavering commitment to ethical excellence and innovative thinking. Outside my window, the city lights of Ashford sparkled like stars, many of them managed by systems my company had designed. Around the world, other cities were implementing technologies that would improve millions of lives. Young consultants were building careers integrity weren't just compatible, they were inseparable. I opened my laptop and began typing. The most valuable lesson I've learned in 37 years of business is this. Betrayal can be the greatest gift someone ever gives you because it forces you to discover strengths you didn't know you possessed and to build something more authentic than anything you could have created in compromise. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.